Hi, my name is Tyler Mowry, and welcome to the Writer's Mind Podcast, episode 20. All right, welcome to another episode, Patreon members. I'm glad that you are here. So today, what I want to talk about is Fight Club, the film mainly, but also the author, some things he has said, and just talk about the philosophy of this story. So, this podcast is about philosophy and about storytelling and this sort of thing, and so I really wanted to take a bit of a deeper look at the philosophy behind this film. Right now, I am making a video on Fight Club that should go up in, I guess, a couple weeks, maybe about the same time as this podcast. I can't remember. But the point is, I've been thinking about the philosophy behind this film and kind of why the story works and why it has remained such a cult classic since its release 2 decades ago. So, what Fight Club is about is a character who is completely out of sync with the modern world. He's working a job that he hates. He is living a life that he hates. He is buying things that he doesn't really need. He can't sleep. And part of the reason that he can't sleep is because he is stressed out about the meaning of his life. So what he does in the story is he goes and he begins attending different support group meetings and realizes that even though his life is monotonous and boring, that other people have it worse, and he kind of takes solace in that. But then the story really evolves, and he meets Tyler Durden, and then the story really takes off, where we have the beginning of Fight Club, and we have the real philosophy of the film start to take shape. And what the story is about is essentially a group of men who believe that they are not correctly adjusted to society, and they believe that the world around them is completely fake, that it has been built by us, but we are not actually built for this world, and that we are existing in an unnatural state, and that what we must do is essentially tear down the world around us because nothing in this world matters, and we don't matter, and we're just out here doing things, and we should not adhere to this system, essentially. And so one of the big elements of the story is the fact that there are these fight clubs. And what the Fight Club is it is these men engaging in physical combat to feel alive and to connect with their more carnal or more natural state of being, their more animalistic state of being. And the story is really interesting because the author of the book, Fight Club, Chuck Palahniuk, he talks about how there is a lot of freedom in this sort of rough play, and that especially for men, having this element of rough play kind of gives us more control over our lives, and it gives us a better understanding of who we are, and it gives us the boundaries of the world better, and it gives us an ability to rely on ourselves to handle situations and these sorts of things. And so one of the elements of the book and one of the elements of the film, because they're very similar, is this idea that the world has become sort of just pacified and safe, and at the same time we have all decided to do useless things like sit in offices and work on spreadsheets and these sorts of things. And so what the story then evolves into over the Fight Club idea is this idea of Project Mayhem, which is all of these people who are involved in these fight clubs then going out and wreaking havoc on the world, destroying the system that we have. And so what's interesting about Fight Club is Fight Club takes a very pessimistic, nihilistic view on our society. Or what's interesting is it takes some basic presuppositions, and then the conclusions of those presuppositions are pessimistic or are negative. So, for example, the story starts off and it says, the world is like this. We work useless jobs. The things that we've built are meaningless. Everything is a number. People are numbers. We are buying things we don't need to impress people we don't care about. Therefore, conclusion of that idea is self-destruction, societal destruction. Let's tear it all down. It's completely meaningless. Therefore, we should look to tear this all down. So, what's really interesting about the story is how the initial presuppositions, the initial statements it gives before it takes any action, a lot of people can resonate with that element of it, right? It definitely feels that there are elements of our lives that are kind of meaningless, that we've kind of set this system up for organizational purposes and we're just sort of doing this thing, you know? There are definitely people that I know and all around where, and even, you know, certain things that I do where we're doing sort of meaningless tasks that don't like really affect anything. And we can definitely have days where we're just kind of in this weird system of modern 2021 living, this sort of, you know, new world that we created, this kind of safe world. And so then the film takes those presuppositions that I think a lot of people can get behind, and then it takes this pessimistic practical action with it, which is to say, okay, therefore, let's tear it down. And what I think is interesting is if you wanted to, you could go in the opposite direction, right? So if movies or if great stories are about communicating these philosophical ideas, communicating ways to live, how should we take action, you know, this is all things that Fight Club is doing. What you as a writer could come in and do is say, okay, let's take these presuppositions that the world is sort of artificial, or the world that we have built, the culture we have built is kind of artificial. We kind of do a lot of useless things. And then you could go optimistic with this and say, okay, rather than just seeking to tear this system down, can we build a better world with an understanding that we need to return to elements of ourselves that are more in line with the natural way that we must live? So, rather than being like, oh, I work this dead-end job, I don't have any friends, I don't have any strong connections, therefore I should, you know, try to destroy this society, you could say, okay, I'm working a dead-end job, I don't have these friendships, therefore let me move out of this world to then find the things that naturally align with my biological predispositions for happiness and contentment and satisfaction and these sorts of things. So, for example, this would be forcing yourself to go and find meaningful work in some way. It would be forcing yourself to say, okay, hey, let's as a group create a community where we are not having people that are just out in society without any friends, without any support systems, right? Or you could say, okay, let's integrate some of these ideas of, you know, what Fight Club is talking about, rough play, of tapping into our natural desire to be aggressive, to fight, to have that release. Let's find ways to do this. And you can really build an entire philosophy off of that idea. And, you know, you could actually take all sorts of, you could create different stories based upon how you're applying some of these ideas that both this new story and Fight Club would agree with. So what I'm saying is, if the new story says, okay, well, the world we live in, the culture we live in is kind of fake, artificial, we do a lot of meaningless things, therefore, now the whole thing is about starting some sort of cult, right? Where people go out into the woods and they can create some sort of cult-like community, or it doesn't necessarily have to be cult-like, but they create a community that's based upon living close together, that's based upon going away from the world, that is based upon, putting your food into the ground, growing your own food, staying with the community, doing meaningful work, etc., etc., etc. So then what you could do is you could create a story with the same basic principles that Fight Club starts out with, and then have a radically different endpoint, all dependent on your particular viewpoint on how this existential philosophical problem should be solved, right? And so what's interesting is you could even look at things like the Unabomber, right? Ted Kaczynski, and what was his idea, right? His basic premise was the idea that, the world, we have run out of real problems to solve. And so therefore we have run out of meaningful things to do. And so because of that, we are now just existing in a world that is bland and useless, and we're doing useless things. So his initial action was to go out in the woods and live like they did hundreds of years ago, and to grow his own food, to be by himself, and to essentially run this personal experiment that was also this philosophical experiment. And so then what happened later on is then he sent bombs to universities, and his plan was to begin to destroy the knowledge that people had, because the knowledge that we had made us unhappy, in the sense that we didn't have any real good problems to solve anymore. Everything was kind of just solved. So then we had impossible problems we could never solve, like heavy existential problems, and simple problems that were pretty easy to solve. And so that was the practical application of the ideas that he held. And so what is interesting about storytelling and handling different philosophical ideas is that you can go in different directions depending on your particular viewpoint on a set of presuppositions we all sort of agree with. So we all agree that the world that we have now is artificial in the sense that we built these houses, we built these cars, we built roads, we created all of these things called restaurants that we all go and eat at, we have these things called phones, we have these laptops, we stay inside with air conditioning, our food is made in factories, we don't know where it comes from. And so it's easy for us to get anybody on board with that basic presupposition, that the world is artificial and there's a lot of things that we do that are unnatural to us, and in that process we have lost an element of ourselves. That's the starting point. And then it's interesting to think about what type of stories you can make with that. So, and Fight Club is one of them. And so what I think is interesting about Fight Club is that it taps into this ideology that I think is most common for younger men, right? Men that are high school age or college age, this sort of 20-year-old nihilism that the film presents. And then what's interesting is when you get older, I think there are different ways of looking at this, but I think that being 20, it's attractive in the sense of wanting to do this thing that is simply destructive. I think we have a propensity to go towards things that is simply destructive sometimes, especially in that age range. And so what's interesting is I think that you can have long term, you have sort of a growth where you can come out the other side and say, okay, even though sometimes things can be artificial and wrong, there is still meaning to be found, and we should still operate within this system to find that meaning. And then how do we do that is an interesting question. And I think that you can look at a lot of different that in a lot of different ways. What's interesting that Chuck Palahniuk says is he talked about this on a Joe Rogan podcast, is he talked about how there are not a lot of books about like living as men in our culture today. He makes a statement that there is a lot of those for women, but there don't seem to be a lot of them for men. And he talks about how really you have Fight Club and you have Dead Poet Society as the two main stories that sit as these ideas of, hey, here's, young men trying to figure out how to exist in this society. And so he kind of makes a statement that we kind of need more of those stories. And it's interesting comparing Dead Poet Society to Fight Club because there is certain similarities. The ideas about coming together as a group to do something that you collectively believe is meaningful that then changes the world around you. There's a lot of similarities between those ideas. Now, what's different is Dead Poet Society is very much an optimistic sort of story where bad things happen and things go poorly, and there is a dark side to that story, but the main push is the idea that like you have to go out and seek out how you are going to fully live in this world and not to be sucked in to where we meet the main character of Fight Club in his, dead-end job that he hates and, he wants to die. So Dead Poet Society is about, carpe diem. It's about seizing the day. That's something they repeat again and again in that story. Dead Poet Society is about thinking for yourself. Dead Poet Society is about not always following what everyone around you says and does and thinks, but carving your own way and finding meaning in that pursuit. And so that is what Dead Poet Society leaves you with versus a Fight Club, which is saying the world is simply useless and meaningless, and there's nothing you can do but thrash at everyone around you until it's over. But what's interesting about Fight Club is that even within this ideology about how everything is meaningless and things just need to be torn down, you watch, especially with Project Mayhem, that there still is this idea of community and of a system that is necessary to get something done, right? So what's funny about some versions of nihilism and what's funny about what we see in Fight Club is that we are watching these people who are saying that there is no meaning and we must destroy the society work together for the meaningful goal in their eyes of destroying society. So through their pursuit of having no meaning, being alone, realizing that everything is artificial and meaningless, they come together for a meaningful purpose. And so there's kind of an inherent contradiction in that idea that when you have a system like that and you have goals and you have traditions and you have ceremonies, all things that they eventually have in this Fight Club film and in the Fight Club story, you are creating a meaningful subculture around not being meaningful. And so there's kind of this interesting inherent contradiction in that. And so what Fight Club did was it actually did something new, not in the sense of trying to have an interesting story concept, but in actually having something to say that wasn't really being talked about in our society. Fight Club was actually setting itself up philosophically to be an original story. And that is what made all of the difference, because so many people are around here trying to chase original concepts, but nobody seems to be out here trying to chase original philosophical points of view. And that seems to be the more important element. And so I think that as you are going into your own writing, it's important for you to realize that your originality is going to come in you creating practical action for your characters through these different ideas that you are looking at in a given situation. Whether that's a societal idea or whether that's a smaller idea like a family idea or even an individual struggle. Your ability to say, okay, here's kind of a presupposition, kind of an idea that we all can understand. Now, how do I bring this idea to its furthest conclusion so that I can most challenge my characters and then also challenge the viewers of this as well through forcing them to stay along for the ride to the end of this idea with my characters. And if you can do that, that is how you are actually going to create an original story and a story that stays with people over time. And something I mentioned in my YouTube video, which I want to talk about again here, is that in the Fight Club story or in the Fight Club film, it's not necessarily like a well-structured story. Like if you actually plot it out and you look at what happens and you look at kind of the want and cost to momentum relationship, like it's kind of weak in some areas. Like a lot of things happen a lot of things happen like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, rather than being like, but then this happens, and so because of this happens, which creates this thing, but this, which is more how you want a story to flow. But the Fight Club film goes a lot more like, oh, and then this happened, and this happened, and then this happened. And so it's not well structured. It doesn't have a strong momentum. But it still survived as this classic because philosophically it was saying something interesting. And so I really think philosophical conflict, like if you actually create strong philosophical conflict, it has a way of hiding some of the other mistakes that you might make in a story. The audience may overlook things that you've done wrong because they are so enamored with the core ideas that your story is bringing forward. And so this is why I've consistently said that understanding your philosophical conflict and aligning your story on that is the most important thing you can do. Because if you just have like a story that's a concept with a really tight structure, there's all sorts of holes and problems and nitpicks that you can make, but you can have major issues even in your structure and even in some of your scenes, maybe even in your dialogue, but that people just overlook completely if you have that strong philosophical conflict attached to characters and characters that are actually taking action to bring that philosophical conflict to the end of the road, to actually bring it to the fullest extent and then see what you find there, to see if you have like a legitimate viewpoint. And that's what I think Fight Club tried to do, and that's why it stayed. And so, if you haven't seen Fight Club, I really recommend you watch it. And if you have, I recommend you go back and watch it, and I want you to think about how much that story is specifically talking about philosophical ideas. Again and again and again, over the course of the story, it's talking about philosophical ideas. And that there are ways that you can do the same thing in your own story And also watch how the film continues to push and push and push and push the philosophical ideas until we get to that final climax. So that's what I have for you this week, and I will see you guys next week.